Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. In our journey through the annals of crime, we often encounter individuals driven to the most desperate and unbelievable measures. Today, we explore the ultimate act of deception, faking one's own death. What could push someone to erase their existence and weave such a complex web of lies? We will examine the case of a man who meticulously staged his demise to escape his problems, fooling his family and the authorities. But as he would discover, a phantom life built on deceit is a fragile prison, one that eventually and inevitably collapses. Case 1. The Canoe Man's Deception. Our first story begins not with a sudden act of violence, but with the quiet, creeping dread of financial ruin. It unfolds in Seaton Carew, a seaside town in County Durham, England. Here, the North Sea is a constant presence, a vast, gray, and indifferent backdrop to the lives of its residents. For John and Darwin, the sea, which had been a source of pleasure, was about to become an accomplice in an extraordinary deception. John Darwin was a man of grand ambitions that far outstripped his means. A former teacher turned prison officer, he had a penchant for building a property portfolio. By the early 2000s, he and a doctor's receptionist had purchased 2 adjacent houses on the seafront, with plans to rent them out. But John's financial acumen was not as sharp as his ambition. He accumulated debt at an alarming rate, taking out loans and credit cards, sinking deeper and deeper into a hole of his own making. The pressure mounted, becoming an unspoken third party in their marriage. The threat of bankruptcy was no longer a distant fear. It was an impending certainty, a wave about to crash over their lives and pull everything under. It was in this climate of desperation that a plan began to form in John's mind. It was a plan as audacious as it was final. He wouldn't just escape his debts, he would escape his very existence. He would fake his own death. The sea, so close to their home, offered the perfect stage. A canoeing accident, tragic, plausible, and almost impossible to disprove without a body. The key to the entire scheme was, and John could not execute this plan alone. He needed his wife to be his co-conspirator, his grieving widow, the one who would convince the world, and most painfully, their own 2 sons, that he was gone forever. And, described by those who knew her as quiet and gentle, was faced with an unimaginable choice: report her husband's reckless financial behavior and face public ruin, or become a partner in a crime that would tear her family apart from the inside out. Torn between loyalty to her husband and the crushing weight of the potential consequences, she reluctantly, devastatingly, agreed. The web of lies had found its first, most crucial thread. On the morning of March 21st, 2002, the plan was set into motion. John Darwin took his vibrant red canoe, a vessel named the Catriona, and paddled out into the cold, choppy waters of the North Sea. The conditions were challenging, even for an experienced canoeist. Later that day, as planned, Darwin reported her husband missing. She made a frantic call to the authorities, her voice choked with a carefully rehearsed panic. She told them John had gone out to sea and had not returned. The response was immediate and massive. A full-scale search and rescue operation was launched. Lifeboats scoured the coastline, and a helicopter buzzed overhead, its searchlight cutting through the fading light of the English day. The community of Seaton Carew held its breath, hoping for a miracle, and played her part to perfection. She stood on the shore, a solitary, forlorn figure, staring out at the unforgiving sea. She spoke to the police, to reporters, and to concerned neighbors, her performance of a grief-stricken wife utterly convincing. Her most difficult performance was for her own sons, Anthony and Mark. They rushed to their mother's side, devastated by the news. They comforted her, held her, and shared in a grief that, for her, was a complete fabrication. Every tear she shed in their presence was a calculated lie, every hug a betrayal. The weight of this particular deceit would become the heaviest burden for her to bear. As she held her grieving sons, she was acutely aware that the man they were mourning was, at that very moment, alive and well, hiding just a stone's throw away. The search continued for days, but John Darwin was nowhere to be found. The sea had seemingly claimed him. A few weeks later, the shattered remains of his red canoe washed ashore. It was the final piece of evidence needed to close the case. John Darwin was officially declared missing, presumed dead. With her husband legally erased, Anne's next task was to navigate the bureaucracy of death. She obtained a death certificate, a document that was both a lie and a key. This key unlocked the financial rewards of their scheme. Life insurance policies were cashed in, pensions were paid out, and mortgages were cleared. In total, and collected approximately £250,000. The debts that had threatened to drown them were gone, washed away by a fictional tragedy. But where was John? He hadn't vanished into thin air. For the first few months, he lived a strange, nomadic existence, camping rough and staying in a simple bedsit he had secretly purchased next door to the family home. He grew a long, shaggy beard and adopted a limp, transforming himself into a new character, John Jones. He would watch his own home from the window of his bedsit, a ghost observing the life he had left behind. Eventually, the arrangement became even more audacious. John moved back into the family home, living in secret in the bedsit-turned-annex that was connected to the main house. A hidden doorway was constructed behind a wardrobe in the master bedroom, allowing him to move between the two properties undetected. His world shrank to a few small rooms. He spent his days on the internet, learning about ways to create new identities and listening. He could hear his wife on the phone, maintaining the facade of the grieving widow. He could hear his sons when they came to visit, their voices filled with a sadness he himself had authored. It was a surreal, claustrophobic existence. He was a prisoner in his own home, a phantom haunting the life he had supposedly lost. And the strain was immense. Life became a tightrope walk. She lived in constant fear of discovery. A casual visitor, an unexpected knock on the door, a slip of the tongue, any of these could bring the entire charade crashing down. She had to lie to everyone she had ever known, her friends, her colleagues, and most agonizingly, her children. When her sons came to visit, John would retreat into his hidden room, holding his breath as they walked just feet away from him, completely unaware of their father's presence, and would later describe the profound guilt she felt, watching her sons grieve for a man who was, at that very moment, listening to their conversations through a wall. As the years passed, John and Anne began to dream of a new life, a final escape. The money they had secured from the insurance payouts was their ticket out of the gray skies of England. They settled on a destination, Panama. The tropical country offered a warm climate, a relaxed attitude to foreign residents, and, most importantly, a chance to be together in the open, free from the secrets that had defined their lives for years. In 2006, for years after John's death, they began to make their move and traveled to Panama, scouting for properties and setting up a new life. John, using a fake passport obtained with the name of a deceased child, followed her. For a brief period, it seemed their audacious plan had worked. They purchased a flat in Panama City and a large plot of land in the Colón province with plans to build an eco-resort. They were John and again, a couple starting over. It was during this time in Panama that they made their fatal mistake. In July 2006, they met with a Panamanian property agent. To mark the occasion, the agent's wife took a photograph. It showed a smiling John and Anne, standing side by side under the Panamanian sun. The photo was uploaded to the company's website, a digital footprint in a world they were trying to escape. At the time, it seemed insignificant. It was just one photo among thousands on the internet, a fleeting digital moment. But it would become the single piece of evidence that would unravel everything. Their Panamanian dreams soon hit a snag. A change in visa laws meant that John's identity would need to be officially verified by the British police for him to gain permanent residency. His fake passport would not withstand that level of scrutiny. The walls were closing in again. They were trapped, not by debt, but by their own deception. John Darwin, ever the schemer, concocted one final, desperate plan. He would return to England. He wouldn't sneak back in. He would walk right through the front door of a police station. His story would be that he had amnesia. He would claim to have no memory of the past 5 years, hoping that this would explain his disappearance and allow him to reclaim his old identity without facing criminal charges. It was a gamble of breathtaking arrogance. On December 1st, 2007, a man with a beard, looking tanned and healthy, walked into the West End Central Police Station in London. He approached the desk and calmly stated, "I think I am a missing person." He gave his name as John Darwin. The news was a bombshell. The man who had been lost at sea 5 years ago had miraculously reappeared. The media descended on the story, painting it as a tale of incredible survival and mystery. His sons, Mark and Anthony, were overwhelmed with a confusing mix of shock, joy, and disbelief. They had mourned their father, scattered his ashes, or what they believed to be his ashes, into the sea, and tried to move on with their lives. Now he was back. They flew to London and were reunited with him. The reunion was emotional and bewildering. John stuck to his script, claiming he could remember nothing after 2000. His sons, desperate to believe, embraced the father they thought they had lost forever. And, still in Panama, played her part over the phone. She expressed astonishment and delight to the press, telling reporters she couldn't wait to be reunited with the husband she thought was dead. She sold their assets in Panama and booked a flight back to the UK, preparing to step back into her role as the loving, long-suffering wife. But the web of lies, stretched over 5 years and 2 continents, was about to snap. The police were initially baffled, but they were also suspicious. John's story had inconsistencies. His tan looked more like a holiday tan than that of a man who had been living rough. His memory loss seemed conveniently selective. And then, a diligent police financial investigator, conducting a simple internet search, found the needle in the digital haystack. It was the photograph from Panama, dated July 2006. There, clear as day, was the amnesiac John Darwin, smiling alongside his grieving wife for years after he had supposedly drowned. The image was undeniable. The entire amnesia story, the entire 5-year deception, collapsed in an instant. The police now knew they were dealing with a massive fraud. When Anne's plane landed at Manchester Airport, she was not met by a throng of well-wishing reporters, but by waiting police officers. Confronted with the photograph, the immense pressure she had been under for 5 years finally broke her. The lies crumbled, and the truth came pouring out. She confessed everything. John Darwin was arrested. His amnesia act evaporated. The case against them was overwhelming. The trial laid bare the intricate details of their deception, the secret life next door, the hidden room, the fake passport, the insurance payouts, and the final, fatal trip to Panama. The most powerful testimony came not from financial experts or police officers, but from their own sons. Mark and Anthony Darwin took the stand and spoke of their profound sense of betrayal. They described the genuine, gut-wrenching grief they had experienced. They had believed their father was dead. They had comforted their mother, unaware that she was a co-conspirator in a cruel charade that made them the primary victims. In a victim impact statement, Mark Darwin said, "I've been in a state of turmoil. How could our ma'am, the loving, gentle parent that I had known for all my life, have been capable of such a cold and calculated deception?" Anthony described feeling as though he had been the victim of a marvelous fraud, his entire world turned upside down. They publicly disowned their parents. In July 2008, John Darwin was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison for deception. And Darwin, whose defense argued she was a victim of marital coercion, was sentenced to 6 years and 6 months for her part in the fraud. The judge acknowledged her predicament, but stated that the deception of her own sons was unforgivable. The story of John and Darwin is a study in the quiet corrosion of deceit. It began as a desperate, albeit criminal, solution to a financial problem. But the lie took on a life of its own, demanding constant maintenance and inflicting deep, irreparable wounds on the people they claimed to love the most. They succeeded in escaping their debts, but in doing so, they lost something far more valuable: their family, their integrity, and their past. The canoeman's deception didn't just fake a death. It destroyed 2 lives and broke the hearts of the 2 people who trusted them completely. Case 2. The Skydiver's Grand Escape. From the quiet desperation of a seaside English town, our exploration of faked deaths now takes us across the Atlantic to the heartland of America, where the illusion was not built with whispered lies in a hidden room, but with a grand, explosive gesture designed for the world to see. This is the story of Marcus Schrenker, a man who didn't just want to disappear. He wanted to go out in a blaze of supposed glory. His stage was not a small canoe, but a high-performance single-engine aircraft, and his audience was the entire nation. On the surface, Marcus Schrenker was the embodiment of the American dream, amplified to its most extravagant level. In the suburbs of Indianapolis, Indiana area known more for its steadfast, Midwestern values than for opulent excess, Schrenker had constructed a kingdom for himself. He lived with his wife, Michelle, and their 3 children in a sprawling 10,000-square-foot mansion in a gated community nicknamed Cocktail Cove for its wealthy, party-loving residents. The property boasted a swimming pool, a private boat dock on the Geist Reservoir, and a fleet of luxury vehicles, including a Lexus and a Corvette. But Schrenker's most prized possessions were his 2 airplanes, one of which was a high-performance Piper PA 46 Malibu Meridian. To his clients and neighbors, Schrenker was a financial wizard, a charismatic, confident man who had mastered the art of making money. He ran several financial services companies, promising handsome returns and secure retirements. He was a thrill-seeker, a licensed pilot who loved to fly, a man who seemed to live life at full throttle, without fear and without limits. His lifestyle was a testament to his success, a carefully curated image of wealth and power. But like many such images, it was a fragile veneer, stretched thin over a foundation of lies and impending collapse. By late 2008, the gilded cage Marcus Schrenker had built for himself was beginning to rattle. The global financial crisis was sending shockwaves through the economy, and Schrenker's clients were discovering that the financial wizard was, in reality, a predator. He had sold them risky, unsuitable annuities and misrepresented investments, allegedly charging exorbitant fees while their life savings dwindled. Lawsuits began to pile up. Investors who had trusted him with their futures were now facing ruin, and they wanted their money-back money that was long gone, spent on the mansion, the cars, and the planes. The state of Indiana was closing in, investigating him for violating securities laws. Federal investigators were also circling, probing what increasingly looked like a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The pressure was immense. The man who projected an aura of invincible success was facing complete and total humiliation. He was on the verge of losing everything: his money, his reputation, and his freedom. His personal life was disintegrating just as quickly. His marriage to Michelle, once a partnership in showcasing their lavish lifestyle, was crumbling under the financial strain and the weight of his deceptions. On December 30th, 2008, she filed for divorce. Just a day later, state investigators searched his home, seizing computers and documents. The noose was tightening. For a narcissist like Marcus Schrenker, the prospect of being exposed as a failure and a fraud was a fate worse than death. And so, like John Darwin before him, he decided to choose death in his own spectacular terms. His plan was far more dramatic than a simple canoeing accident. It was a piece of high-stakes theater. On Sunday, January 11th, 2009, Schrenker filed a flight plan. He would fly his Piper Meridian from an airfield in Anderson, Indiana, to Destin, Florida, a popular vacation spot on the Gulf Coast. It was a route he had flown before. It seemed routine. But nothing about this flight would be routine. Before he left, he made sure his affairs were in a peculiar kind of order. He paid a neighbor a few $100s to look after his German Shepherd. And he wrote a chilling, rambling email to another neighbor and friend, Tom Britt. He instructed Britt not to open it until Monday morning. In the email, Schrenker painted himself as a victim, a man driven to the edge. It was a suicide note of sorts, but also a final, self-serving attempt to control the narrative. The reality of his situation, he wrote, was too much to bear. That afternoon, Schrenker took off, alone in his powerful aircraft, climbing into the cold January sky. He flew south, crossing Kentucky and Tennessee. As he entered Alabama airspace, somewhere south of Birmingham, he put his audacious plan into action. At 5:16 p.m. Central Time, a distress call crackled through the headsets of air traffic controllers. It was Marcus Schrenker. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, for the situation he was describing. "I'm in a 464 Alpha Mike. I've had a windshield implosion, and I am bleeding profusely." He reported that the cockpit glass had shattered, that the cabin was depressurizing, and that he was severely injured. It was a terrifying scenario. The controllers tried to guide him to a nearby airport, but Schrenker's responses became intermittent. He put the aircraft on autopilot, set its course for the Gulf of Mexico, and then his transmission ceased. To the controllers on the ground, it appeared a pilot was desperately trying to save his aircraft before succumbing to his injuries or the elements. They watched helplessly as the radar blip of the Piper Meridian continued on its steady, unmanned course towards the Florida coast. The protocol for such an event, a NORDO or no radio contact aircraft, was immediately enacted. The U.S. military scrambled two F-15 fighter jets from a base in New Orleans to intercept the ghost plane. As the fighters closed in, their pilots reported a surreal sight. The door of the Piper was ajar, swinging in the wind. The cockpit was dark. There was no sign of a pilot. The plane was flying itself, a silent, empty vessel on a final, deadly trajectory. The jets escorted the pilotless aircraft as it flew over the Florida Panhandle until, its fuel exhausted, it spiraled down from the sky. It crashed into a swampy, wooded bayou near Milton, Florida, more than 200 miles from where Schrenker had made his last transmission. The initial news reports painted a picture of a tragic accident. A wealthy pilot, a catastrophic aircraft failure, a brave but futile struggle. But when investigators reached the crash site, the story began to unravel almost immediately. They waded through the murky water and tangled cypress trees to the wreckage. The aircraft was mangled, but the cockpit canopy was largely intact. There was no shattered windshield. More importantly, there was very little blood, certainly not the amount one would expect from a man bleeding profusely. And most tellingly, there was no body. Marcus Schrenker had vanished. The tragedy was now a mystery, and suspicion quickly fell on Schrenker himself. Had he orchestrated the whole thing? While the world was watching his plane crash, where was he? The answer lay in the dark woods of central Alabama. Marcus Schrenker had not been injured. The distress call was a complete fabrication. After placing the call, he had calmly strapped on a parachute, put the plane on autopilot, and leaped out into the night sky. He was not a victim. He was a fugitive. His plan, however, was not as flawless as he imagined. He landed near the town of Childersburg, Alabama. He had thought this through, to a point. He had pre-stashed a motorcycle in a storage unit nearby. His goal was to get to the motorcycle, disappear into the anonymity of the American highway system, and start a new life. But his escape began with a miscalculation. Dressed in layers to protect him from the cold jump, he approached a private residence, his face covered by a black visor. He told the resident a story about being in a canoeing accident, a strange echo of the Darwin case, and asked for a ride into town. The resident, suspicious of the oddly dressed stranger appearing out of the woods at night, refused but called the local police. By the time Officer Casey Rains arrived, Schrenker had managed to talk his way into the police station. He gave a fake name and claimed he was a hitchhiker. He was wet and cold. Officer Rains, unaware of the national drama unfolding, felt a measure of sympathy and, incredibly, gave him a ride to a nearby hotel. Schrenker had slipped through the first net. He spent the night at the hotel, and the next morning, he made his way to the storage unit, retrieved his red Yamaha motorcycle, complete with the license plate he had stolen, and hit the road. He was now on the run, a man trying to outrace his own collapsing world. But in the 21st century, true anonymity is a fantasy. A multi-state manhunt was now in full swing, led by the U.S. Marshal Service. His face was on every news channel. The email he had sent to his neighbor, Tom Britt, had been opened and turned over to the authorities. It provided a clear insight into his state of mind and confirmed that his disappearance was intentional. His digital footprint and his past actions were creating a trail. Authorities learned of the storage unit and the motorcycle. They knew what he was driving. Schrenker, meanwhile, was making mistakes. He rode south, deeper into Florida, perhaps heading towards the very destination he had listed on his flight plan. He stopped at a KOA campground in Quincy, Florida, near the Georgia border. He paid cash for a spot in the tent-only area, far from the RVs and family campers. He bought a 6-pack of beer and a map. He used a payphone. He tried to access the internet from the camp's Wi-Fi, a move that would prove to be another critical error. He was trying to lay low, but his every action was creating a breadcrumb for the technologically savvy investigators on his tail. The U.S. Marshals, using tips from the public and tracking his potential movements, began to zero in on the Florida Panhandle. A tip from the KOA campground manager, who recognized Schrenker from the news, was the break they needed. On the evening of Tuesday, January 13th, just 2 days after he had jumped from his plane, a heavily armed team of U.S. Marshals descended on the campground. They found Schrenker's tent, tucked away in a remote corner. Inside, they found him, not defiant, not ready for a final confrontation, but semi-conscious and weak. He had slit his left wrist in an apparent suicide attempt. His grand, dramatic escape had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, in a cheap tent, bleeding into the dirt. He was taken to a hospital in Tallahassee, where he was treated for his self-inflicted wounds. Upon his recovery, the full weight of the justice system came down on him. The charges were numerous: intentionally crashing his aircraft, making a false distress call, and a litany of federal fraud charges related to his financial schemes. The investigation that followed laid bare the depth of his criminality. He had cheated dozens of clients, many of them elderly, out of more than $1.5 million. He had lived his life of luxury on the stolen savings of hardworking people. The stories of his victims were heartbreaking. They spoke of lost retirements, of futures destroyed by a man they had trusted implicitly. In August 2009, Marcus Schrenker pleaded guilty to the aircraft-related charges and was sentenced to 4 years and 3 months in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay $34,000 to the Coast Guard for the cost of the search and nearly $900,000 in restitution to the owner of the destroyed aircraft. It was owned by one of his own companies, but financed through a bank. Later, he would face additional sentencing for his financial crimes, adding another 10 years to his prison term. His wife, Michelle, finalized their divorce and publicly stated she had no knowledge of his crimes or his escape plan, though she too faced legal troubles over assets. The case of Marcus Schrenker is a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of ego. Unlike John Darwin, whose crime was born of a quiet, creeping desperation, Schrenker's was an act of supreme narcissism. Faced with the destruction of his carefully crafted public image, he couldn't simply disappear. He had to create a myth. He wanted to be remembered as the pilot who fought valiantly until the end. But his web of lies was too grand, too audacious, and too technologically naive to succeed. He sought to escape his life by faking his death, but in the end, he only succeeded in exposing the truth of who he really was, not a financial wizard or a tragic hero, but a common thief who crashed his own life long before he crashed his plane. Case 3. The drowning that never was. Our journey now leads us to the crowded, sun-drenched shores of Long Island, New York. Here, against the backdrop of crashing waves and the sounds of summer, another man sought to be consumed by the water, not out of a grand, dramatic exit like Marcus Schrenker, but through a seemingly simple, tragic accident. This is the story of Raymond Roth, a man whose desperate attempt to wash away his problems was undone not by a forgotten photograph or a military escort, but by the frantic, panicked love of the very son he had enlisted as his co-conspirator. Raymond Roth lived in Massapequa, a sprawling suburb on the south shore of Long Island. It is a place of manicured lawns, family homes, and a life rhythm dictated by the commute to and from New York City. To his neighbors, Roth was an unremarkable figure, a middle-aged man living a typical suburban life. He had been a manager at a telecommunications company, a position that afforded him a comfortable, if not extravagant, lifestyle. He was married to a woman named Ivana and had a son, Jonathan, from a previous relationship. But by the summer of 2012, the foundations of this ordinary life had cracked. Roth had lost his job. The steady income that supported his suburban existence was gone, and he found himself unmoored, both financially and psychologically. He tried to start his own consulting business, but it failed to gain traction. The bills mounted, and the shame of his unemployment grew. He was, in his own mind, a failure. He had been reported for threatening a former colleague and was facing the possibility of his handgun license being revoked. He felt his life spiraling out of control, and like the men in our previous stories, he began to see a conventional escape route as impossible. He needed a reset button, a way to wipe the slate clean. And, as is so often the case in these tales, he believed that faking his own death was the answer. The plan was crude, lacking the meticulous, long-term planning of John Darwin or the dramatic flair of Marcus Schrenker. It was a scheme born of pure, unadulterated desperation. He would go to Jones Beach, a popular and often crowded state park, pretend to go for a swim, and simply vanish. His son, 22-year-old Jonathan Roth, would report him missing. The assumption would be that he had been caught in a riptide and swept out to sea. Once he was presumed dead, his wife, Ivana, could collect on life insurance policies totaling around $400,000. It was enough money to solve his immediate problems and, he believed, to set his family up for a new beginning. The most critical and ultimately most tragic element of this plan was the involvement of his son. Raymond didn't just need Jonathan to report him missing, he needed him to be an active participant in the fraud. He laid the plan out for his son, framing it as the only way out of their financial predicament. For Jonathan, it was an impossible position. He was a young man being asked by his own father to perpetrate a serious crime, to lie to the world, and to deceive his own stepmother. The psychological pressure must have been immense. Caught between filial loyalty and the clear immorality of the act, Jonathan agreed. He would help his father disappear. On the morning of Saturday, July 28, 2012, the plan was set in motion. Raymond and Jonathan drove to Jones Beach. The weather was warm, the beach bustling with families and sunbathers. They found a spot and Raymond changed into his swimming trunks. He gave his son his wallet and keys, instructed him on what to do, and then walked towards the Atlantic Ocean. He waded into the surf and disappeared from his son's sight. A short time later, Jonathan Roth did as he was told. He made a panicked 911 call. His voice, captured on the recording, was high-pitched and frantic. "My father went in the water. He went for a swim, and I can't find him. He was in the water, and I lost sight of him." The response was exactly what they had anticipated. It was swift and massive. The local park police, Nassau County Police, and the United States Coast Guard were all dispatched. Helicopters buzzed low over the water, their crews scanning for any sign of a person in distress. Rescue boats crisscrossed the waves, and divers prepared to search the murky depths. On the shore, police officers cordoned off the area, interviewing the distraught-looking young man who had raised the alarm. Jonathan played the part of the grieving son, but his performance was flawed. Witnesses and officers on the scene noted that his distress seemed almost too theatrical, his panic overwrought. He was agitated and restless, constantly on his phone. It was this inability to remain calm, this nervous energy, that first planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the investigators. His behavior was not quite right for a son who had just watched his father vanish into the sea. While the search was in full swing, Raymond Roth was already miles away. He had not drowned. He had simply walked out of the water at a different location down the beach, changed into dry clothes he had stashed, and made his way to a prearranged spot where he had left his car. He then began driving south, leaving the chaos of the search operation behind him. Back at the beach, as the hours ticked by and the sun began to set, the search became a recovery mission. The chances of finding Raymond Roth alive were dwindling to nothing. Jonathan, however, was becoming increasingly unraveled. The reality of what they were doing was crashing down on him. The scale of the police response, the seriousness in the faces of the Coast Guard personnel, the whirring of the helicopter sit was all far more real and intimidating than he had likely imagined. He began to panic, not just that they would be caught, but that something had gone wrong with the plan. What if his father had really gotten into trouble? It was this panic that led him to make the fatal mistake. In a moment of profound foolishness, Jonathan used his cell phone to call his father. He sent his father a series of anxious text messages. "Call me," one read. "It's an emergency." He was worried, desperate for the reassurance that his father was safe and that the plan was still on track. He seemed to forget, in his agitated state, that he was at the center of a major police investigation, an investigation in which his communications would almost certainly be monitored. The police, already suspicious of Jonathan, were indeed watching him. They noted the calls and texts to the missing man's phone. And, crucially, they were able to get a ping from Raymond Roth's cell phone. A cell phone ping can triangulate a device's general location by measuring its signal strength from nearby cell towers. The ping didn't come from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It came from a cell tower in the vicinity of Orlando, Florida. Raymond Roth, the man presumed drowned off the coast of New York, was somehow traveling south. The story of a tragic drowning instantly evaporated, replaced by the clear picture of a criminal conspiracy. While the police were quietly building their case, another front was opening up in the Roth family home. Raymond's wife, Ivana Roth, was at home, dealing with the shock and grief of her husband's apparent death. Friends and family gathered to support her. But as the days passed, she began to notice things that didn't add up. There were inconsistencies in Jonathan's story. And then, she made a discovery that turned her world inside out. She found emails. Emails exchanged between her husband and her stepson in the days leading up to his disappearance. The messages laid out the entire plot in cold, undeniable detail. They discussed the insurance money, the plan for Raymond to disappear, and instructions on how to handle the aftermath. The discovery was a devastating blow. The grief she was feeling for her lost husband was replaced by the sickening realization that she was a pawn in a callous scheme. Her husband was not dead. He was a fugitive. And her stepson, the young man she had been comforting, was his accomplice. Ivana Roth was faced with a choice. She could remain silent, protecting her husband and stepson, and potentially become an accessory to their crime. Or she could go to the authorities and reveal the truth. Her decision was swift and resolute. She took the emails, the irrefutable proof of the conspiracy, and she went to the police. It was an act of immense courage, a decision to choose the truth over a family built on lies. With the evidence from the cell phone pings, and now the damning emails from Ivana, the authorities had everything they needed. The search for a body was called off and replaced by a manhunt for a fugitive. The story exploded in the media. The tale of a tragic drowning became a bizarre story of fraud and family betrayal. Raymond Roth, meanwhile, was continuing his journey. He drove from Florida to a resort in Santee, South Carolina. He checked in, paid cash, and tried to lay low. But he was clumsy. His face was now all over the news. And in another moment of incredible carelessness, on August 1st, just 4 days after faking his death, Raymond Roth was pulled over for speeding in South Carolina. He presented the officer with his valid New York driver's license. The officer, unaware of the national alert for Roth, simply issued him a ticket and let him go. The name on the ticket, Raymond Roth. He was a ghost who couldn't stop leaving a paper trail. The pressure was now on from all sides. His wife had exposed him. The police were closing in. His son had been taken into custody. The grand escape was a catastrophic failure. Seeing no way out, Raymond Roth's attorney contacted the police. On August 2nd, 2012, Raymond Roth walked into a police precinct in New York and turned himself in. His escape had lasted less than a week. He was arrested and charged with insurance fraud, conspiracy, and falsely reporting an incident. His son, Jonathan, faced the same charges. The legal proceedings that followed were a sad and sordid affair. Raymond Roth initially tried to claim that the entire scheme was his son's idea, a desperate attempt to shift blame. But the evidence, particularly the emails, made it clear that he was the architect of the plot. In the end, Raymond Roth pleaded guilty. He admitted that he had been depressed and overwhelmed by his financial problems. He expressed remorse, particularly for the pain he had caused his wife and for involving his son. He was sentenced to a term of intermittent jail time, serving his sentence on weekends and 5 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay back over $36,000 to the Coast Guard and Nassau County Police for the cost of the pointless search and rescue operation. Jonathan Roth, the son caught in an impossible situation, received a more lenient sentence of 3 years probation. The court recognized the immense pressure he had been under from his father. His public defender argued that he was a victim as much as a perpetrator, a young man manipulated by a desperate parent. The story of Raymond Roth stands in stark contrast to our other cases. It lacks the patience of the Darwin's deception or the theatrical arrogance of Schrenker's flight. It was a poorly conceived, clumsily executed plan born of sheer panic. Roth's mistakes were numerous and amateurish, using his real name, getting a speeding ticket, and, most critically, underestimating the emotional fragility of the son he had pulled into his web. This case is a poignant illustration of how a parent's desperation can become a child's burden. Jonathan Roth's frantic calls to his dead father were not the actions of a cold, calculating criminal, but of a scared young man in over his head. It was an act of love and fear that ultimately unraveled the entire lie. The drowning that never was serves as a somber reminder that the deepest betrayals are often reserved for those closest to us, and that a lie, no matter how desperately told, is a fragile vessel in the turbulent waters of truth. Case 4. The Fisherman's Final Disappearance. For our final case, we travel to the celebrity-studded coastline of Southern California, a place where reality and illusion often blur. Here, a disappearance at sea would capture international headlines, not just for the mystery itself, but because of its connection to one of Hollywood's biggest stars. This is a story shrouded in ambiguity, a tale of love, debt, and a final, fateful fishing trip. It is the story of Patrick McDermott, a man who walked onto a boat and seemingly vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin and a question that lingers to this day. Was he a victim of the ocean, or the architect of a brilliant escape? Patrick Kim McDermott was a man who lived adjacent to the limelight. He was a cameraman, a profession that placed him behind the scenes, capturing the lives of others. He was described by those who knew him as a kind, gentle soul, but also as a man burdened by private struggles. He had been married once before and had a son, but the marriage ended in divorce, followed by a bitter custody dispute that left him emotionally and financially scarred. In the late 1990s, he filed for bankruptcy, citing debts of over $30,000. It was a clear sign of a man struggling to stay afloat in the expensive world of Los Angeles. His life changed dramatically when he began a relationship with Olivia Newton-John. The beloved singer and actress, famous for her role in Grease and a string of hit songs, was an international icon. Their on-again, off-again relationship lasted for 9 years. For McDermott, dating such a famous woman brought him into a world of glamour and privilege, but it may also have amplified his own feelings of inadequacy. He was constantly in the shadow of her immense fame, a cameraman dating a superstar. By the summer of 2005, McDermott's financial situation was once again precarious. Despite his high-profile relationship, he was struggling. He was behind on child support payments to his ex-wife, actress Yvette Nipar, and reportedly owed thousands of dollars. The pressure was mounting again. The shame of his debts, a recurring theme in his life, was a heavy weight. It was in this context that he planned a solo, overnight fishing trip. On the evening of June 30th, 2005, Patrick McDermott boarded the Freedom, a 65-foot fishing charter boat, at the 22nd Street Landing in San Pedro, California. He was one of 22 passengers heading out for a night of fishing off the coast of San Clemente Island. He paid for his ticket in cash. He bought some food and drinks from the boat's galley, also paying in cash. He was seen by other passengers and crew members. He was just another fisherman, seeking a temporary escape from the pressures of life on land. The Freedom returned to port the next day, on July 1st. The passengers disembarked and the crew cleaned the boat, preparing for the next trip. No one reported anything amiss. No one noticed that one passenger had not returned. McDermott's car was found parked at the marina. His wallet, keys, and other personal effects were found on the boat. But Patrick McDermott himself was gone. The most baffling aspect of this case is how long it took for anyone to realize he was missing. Because of the on-again, off-again nature of his relationship with Olivia Newton-John, she was not immediately alarmed when she didn't hear from him. He had his own life, his own circle of friends. It was not until he failed to show up for a family event on July 6 that his ex-wife, Yvette Nipar, became concerned. She was the one who officially reported him missing to the Los Angeles Police Department. By the time the investigation began in earnest, Patrick McDermott had been missing for 11 days. The trail was cold. The crucial window for finding witnesses with fresh memories had closed. The initial theory was the most obvious one: a tragic accident. The sea can be a dangerous place, even on a calm night. It was plausible that McDermott had fallen overboard, unnoticed by the other passengers who were focused on their fishing lines or sleeping below deck. The dark water would have swallowed him in moments, leaving no trace. The U.S. Coast Guard was notified, but by this point, any search would be futile. The ocean is vast, and the currents are powerful. If he had gone into the water, his body would likely never be found. The Coast Guard conducted its own investigation into the incident. They interviewed the crew and the other passengers who could be located. Their final report was damning for the Freedom's crew. It concluded that the crew had failed to conduct a proper passenger count before returning to port, a clear violation of safety protocols. They determined that McDermott had likely been lost at sea. Officially, the case was a tragic accident caused by negligence. But as investigators, both official and private, dug deeper into McDermott's life, another theory began to emerge, one that was far more intriguing and complex. This was not just a man who had fallen on hard times. This was a man with a history of financial desperation and a motive to disappear. The bankruptcy, the mounting child support debt, it all painted a picture of someone who might be looking for a permanent escape route. Faking his own death would wipe out his debts and free him from his obligations. The method was plausible. Boarding a crowded boat, paying in cash, and then slipping away seemed like a viable, if risky, plan. Could he have disembarked in a small dinghy, met by an accomplice? Or could he have simply stayed on the boat, hidden, and then walked off unnoticed amidst the post-trip chaos? The crew's failure to do a head count made such scenarios possible. This theory was fueled by a series of strange and unconfirmed sightings. In the years following his disappearance, whispers and rumors began to surface. People claimed to have seen a man matching McDermott's description in Mexico, particularly in the remote coastal towns of the Baja California Peninsula, an area popular with expatriates seeking to live off the grid. Mexico, with its proximity and cash-based economy, would be an ideal place to start a new life with a new identity. The story took a dramatic turn when a team of private investigators, hired by the TV news program Dateline NBC, launched their own inquiry. Lead investigator Philip Klein, a seasoned Texas-based PI, became convinced that McDermott had staged his own death. Klein and his team focused their search on Mexico. They set up a website, findpatrickmcdermott.com, designed to generate tips and public interest. The website used a clever piece of digital tracking technology. It was designed so that every visitor's IP address, a unique identifier for a computer or network, was logged. In 2009, for years after the disappearance, Klein announced a stunning development. He claimed that his team had received over 20 hits on the website from a specific geographic area near Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. The pattern of these visits, Klein argued, suggested that a single person or a small group of people were repeatedly checking the website for updates. He believed it was McDermott himself, unable to resist the narcissistic urge to monitor his own manhunt. Klein went public, declaring with confidence that Patrick McDermott was alive and well, living under a new name in Mexico. The story was sensational. It was picked up by news outlets around the world. The idea that Olivia Newton-John's long-lost love was not a victim but a fugitive was a compelling narrative. Klein's investigation produced more supposed evidence. His team spoke to locals in the Mexican surf town of Sayulita who claimed to have seen a man they called Pat, a man who bore a striking resemblance to McDermott. He was said to be living quietly, working odd jobs, and keeping to himself. However, despite Klein's confident assertions, no concrete proof ever materialized. No photograph, no definitive eyewitness identification, no financial transaction could ever be directly linked to Patrick McDermott. The IP address hits were intriguing, but they were not conclusive evidence. They could have come from curious locals, tourists, or other expats who had heard the story. The sightings were anecdotal, based on fleeting glimpses and fallible human memory. The case remained in a state of limbo, caught between two competing narratives. On one hand, the official conclusion of the U.S. Coast Guard, a man lost at sea in a tragic accident. On the other, the tantalizing but unproven theory of the private investigators, a man who had successfully staged a brilliant escape. Yvette Nipar, McDermott's ex-wife and the mother of his child, remained a staunch advocate for the missing, presumed dead theory. She publicly pleaded with Philip Klein and the media to stop promoting the idea that he was alive, arguing that it was causing immense pain to their son, who had to endure the constant speculation that his father had abandoned him. She saw the investigation not as a search for truth, but as a cruel and exploitative media circus. Olivia Newton-John, for her part, handled the situation with characteristic grace, but the ordeal clearly took a heavy toll. For years, she was haunted by the uncertainty. In interviews, she spoke of the deep pain and confusion. "It's human to wonder," she once said, "but you have to accept and let go." In 2016, more than a decade after his disappearance, she stated that she had finally come to terms with the likelihood that he had died and that she had to move on for her own peace of mind. Then, in 2017, the story took another bizarre twist. An Australian magazine published a grainy photograph of a man with a woman on a beach in Sayulita, Mexico. The magazine claimed this was the first photo of Patrick McDermott since his disappearance. The man in the picture bore a passing resemblance to an older McDermott. The story went viral, but it was quickly debunked. The man in the photograph was identified as a Canadian tourist who came forward with his wife to prove they were not the missing man and his new partner. It was another false lead, another dead end in a case full of them. The story of Patrick McDermott is different from our other cases. There was no confession, no damning photograph like the one that caught the Darwins, no bundled escape like Marcus Schrenker's, and no panicked phone calls like those that exposed Raymond Roth. There is only a void, an absence filled with speculation. If he did die at sea, it was a lonely and anonymous end, a tragic accident made more so by the failure of the boat's crew to notice he was gone. But if he did succeed in faking his death, his was the most successful of them all. He managed to erase himself completely, to melt into the world and begin again, free from the debts and pressures that had defined his previous life. He would have achieved the ultimate escape, but at a terrible cost: the emotional devastation of his son, who was left to wonder for years if his father was dead or had simply chosen to abandon him. The fisherman's final disappearance leaves us with an unsettling ambiguity. It reminds us that sometimes The web of lies is not a complex structure that eventually collapses, but a single, bold thread that leads into the unknown, leaving behind only questions. We may never know for certain whether Patrick McDermott was a victim of the indifferent ocean or the master of his own vanishing act. His story remains a ghost story, a modern maritime mystery where the truth, like a body lost to the depths, may never surface. From a canoe in the cold North Sea to a ghost plane over Alabama, from the crowded beaches of New York to a fishing boat off the California coast, the drive to erase oneself is a powerful and destructive force. These stories are not just about deception. They are about desperation, ego, and the profound ripple effects of a single, monumental lie. They show us that a life built on a phantom death is often more of a prison than the one left behind. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of finding the light. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. We hope these stories have given you not just a glimpse into the darker side of human nature, but also a moment for reflection. Sleep well, and try not to dream of the things that go missing in the night.